Welcome to Tea Time, my friends, a place where I muse about my gender transition experience and in the process aim to comfort and inspire others to a greater level of self-awareness. I am Artemis, sipping a cup of chocolate chip banana bread tea, courtesy of the Rosenvine Cave Company. I did a video about a year ago that has garnered the most attention of any video on this channel so far, and that was my body language analysis on Elliot Page in an interview he did with Oprah. Link above to that video. In the comments of those who disagreed with me, some had mentioned that my deductions were inaccurate because Elliot may be on the neurodivergent or autistic spectrum and therefore atypical in body language expression. This directed me down a research path that led to personal discovery with something called Alexithymia. I found connections between autism, alexithymia, and transgenderism so important that I believed there must be others who would benefit from this knowledge. So I'm going to tie it all together in this video for you. Oh, and since it's becoming more widely used, I'm going to sprinkle in my experience with psychedelics as both a cautionary and guiding anecdote. First, though, there's a little house cleaning to do as an update to the original Elliot video. In that interview between Elliot and Oprah, there were so many red flags to me in Elliot's words and behavior that I felt the need to comment on it. I stand behind all of my reason for using it as an example of the potential pitfalls many are experiencing today in the false diagnosis of gender dysphoria, and mentioned that in Elliot's specific case, I may be wrong. Furthermore, now that we are nearly 3 years out and Elliot is still presenting as consistently male, as far as I can see, I would say that the use of the he/him pronoun for general everyday interaction makes social sense. Hence, today, if I were asked by Elliot to use those pronouns, I would. This is in keeping in line with the personal policy I laid out in that video regarding pronoun usage. I believe it still remains to be seen longer term if cross-sex hormones and top surgery were the best course of treatment for whatever Elliot is experiencing. As for myself and pronouns, I don't care what pronouns someone uses for me, and if you'd like a deep dive into pronoun usage with some historical, logical, and philosophical musings, check out this video I did, link above. To move into the meat of this video, we have some definitions to lay out for clear communication. When I refer to gender, I mean characteristics of behavior or appearance that are either masculine or feminine in nature. And when I refer to sex, I mean either of the two divisions designated female and male, by which most organisms are classified on the basis of their reproductive organs and functions. The term alexithymia literally translates to without words for emotions. And I will go into much more detail as to how this state of experience may relate to some of the prolific self-diagnosis of transgenderism we are seeing today. The viewer comment on my first Elliot video that produced the content for this video stated that I must be allistic because I did not understand Elliot's atypical body language. They were inferring that Elliot was on the autistic spectrum and that I must not be autistic or neurodivergent to be able to relate to it and interpret it properly. To be allistic means to be neurotypical, or at the very least, not autistic. Standard body language reading relies on typical patterns of behavior to interpret true meaning, but may be ineffective at times when used on atypical people and without enough context. Excited to learn a new word and wanting more, I started to dig into the potential correlation between autism and gender identity issues and came across a paper with yet another new term, alexithymia. The link to that paper is in the description box below. It defines alexithymia as an impairment in the awareness of emotions due to a deficit in processing of affective information. The main characteristics of alexithymia include 1. Difficulty identifying feelings and distinguishing between feelings and bodily sensations of emotional arousal. 2. Difficulty describing feelings to other people. 3. Reduced capacity to fantasize and to imagine. 4. Stimulus-bound, externally oriented cognitive style. And more recently, 5. Low perspective taking, as well as difficulty understanding and describing the emotions of others. To break some of this down, In perhaps more relatable terms, those with alexithymia, for example, may say they feel content, but their body language or facial expressions indicate anger or some other emotion. Their internal state does not match what they are projecting. They also do not realize how other people are seeing and perceiving them, and have trouble distinguishing more subtle emotions in others unless they are heightened displays of aggression or sadness, such as raging or crying. When asked how they personally feel, they will often answer with what they think, intellectualizing instead of emoting. They do this because they do not connect their bodily sensations with an emotion and further lack the vocabulary to define the experience, and so often prefer to talk about what they know versus what they do not. Without the external influence of someone else describing to them what their bodily sensation means, they are both unable to communicate this to others and to distinguish between different feelings associated with those sensations. Because of their low resolution on emotions, it's often noted by others that it seems they have very simple emotions, or none at all. This is because they tend to express only the most basic emotions in the extreme, like raging or sobbing, or otherwise seem flat at any other time. In reality, many are still experiencing the range of subtle emotions, but they are either cognitively disconnected from them or suppress them out of fear of overwhelm or loss of control due to their lack of understanding. As we go forward with the connections I will make, it may be useful to think about alexithymia, autism, transgenderism, and gender as spectrums within each individual person, and when comparing the categories, lay them out like a Venn diagram. Further, the borders of the Venn diagrams are more like watercolor with no solid edges. I think it hampers our ability to gain utility from these terms if we think about them as all or nothing boxes, because each person is a complex set of traits that make up their individual experience. A little bit of this, a little bit of that, voila. In this paper I referenced, they talk about the co-occurrence of alexithymia and autism, and in other sources I've read, the combined statistic says that anywhere from 50 to 80% of those with autism also have alexithymia. It's noteworthy that alexithymia is not exclusive to autism and can be experienced due to emotional trauma, brain injury, or as a standalone trait possibly set from birth. That will be relevant later when I talk about my personal anecdote, as well as in explaining how others without autism can still have it, boosting the numbers in the population who experience it. In the United States, the supposed rate of autism is the highest of anywhere else in the world, and it also seems that we have the highest rates of claimed transgenderism as well. Full disclosure, I do not believe that the United States has more medically verifiable transgender or transsexual people, and I think there's a lot of self-misdiagnosis going on. I also believe that people are using the word transgender when what they mean is transsexual, which creates more confusion. And if you want more on that, link above. If we are to simply take the supposed higher rates of autism and also the higher rates of gender confusion with self-reported transgenderism through the lens of alexithymia, this makes perfect sense to me. Imagine this scenario. You're a kid who starts to go through puberty, and the subsequent mental, emotional, and bodily changes seem alien to you. It wasn't that long ago that you possessed the belief that Santa Claus was real and were devoid of any sexual urges. Suddenly, the surge in chemical hormones overwhelm you with urges. Females experience bleeding that can definitely be alarming, and males experience erections that now perform additional functions. If it weren't for the sex ed class at school or your parents or guardians telling you that it's normal, this sort of awakening might cause all kinds of existential crisis questions. In this day and age, though, media, society, and familial influence have taught you what being a man or a woman is about, or supposedly. You believe them because as a kid, you rely on others to tell you what the world is about, not knowing that there are other interpretations because your world includes only as much as what you've been exposed to. However, you don't feel like you can identify with what you've been told or shown at all. You are feeling incredibly lost, like you're broken and you don't fit in. In this age of technology at your fingertips and a social media buffet, you come across claims that if you don't feel like the sex you were born, then you must be transgender, and there is a fix for it. Relieved, you pursue this avenue at all costs. Anything for a cure to this confusion and pain that you feel, and you associate it with pain to avoid because you know at least that these feelings are miserable. Being a human with an underdeveloped frontal cortex until your mid-20s, you lack the ability to reason with these monumental subjects of existence. You're most likely not someone with a sex disorder for whom medical transitioning would be the answer. That statistic is less than 1% of the population. You're probably just an average kid, possibly with alexithymia and or autism, and unable to process your experience rationally because your brain is still developing. Asking them to define who they are would be like trying to ask the Iron Chef what dish they will make before the ingredients have even been revealed. Especially if you have alexithymia, you have the further complication of being unable to distinguish what it is you are actually feeling, let alone what it means and how to process it. This led me to considering just how pervasive alexithymia is, to perhaps help explain why gender confusion seems so rampant amongst our population and teens today. I believe there are many factors, and I've seen multiple explanations offered. One such was Buck Angel's "trans is the new emo," which is to say that it's a social trend. Certainly, I think this contributes, and I'm currently working on another video about the larger societal questioning of gender being a collective existential phenomena, as in the age-old pondering of "who am I?" is now having its time in the sun through the lens of gender and sex. As I mentioned near the beginning, alexithymia can be a standalone trait from birth or can be acquired through mental, emotional, or physical trauma. Children who grow up in homes where they were not welcome to express their emotions, even punished for them, may suppress them to the point that they become divorced from that part of their psyche. This is referred to as fracturing or fragmenting the self. It can occur severely, as in with cases of dissociative identity disorder from childhood sexual trauma, or it can be as simple as a male refusing to acknowledge his sadness by crying because it was highly discouraged by his parents. In either case, it's a short-term adaptive strategy that allows the individual to cope in the abusive situation. But unless the fractured self is reintegrated, this becomes maladaptive and can lead to everything from interpersonal conflict to chronic health problems. It seems to me that people today are realizing the shortcomings of parenting to this point, many recognizing downright abuse that had been considered normal by the standards of their time. I do not blame generations past for what they did not know, or for what they had to cope with themselves. Now that we know better, there's a choice to do differently. So we've established that through alexithymia, whether via autism or mechanisms like abuse, it's understandable for someone with that condition to have confusion around gender identity. It could even be that the use of the term non-binary by many of these individuals is simply a way to express their experience of not being able to identify with what others have described as typical male or female engenderment. Sometimes they simply claim that they don't feel like they can identify with the labels around them and settle on other, non-binary, which makes sense to me. If you have trouble identifying and describing your own feelings, how would you begin to be able to tell if others' described experience was the same as your own? So they call themselves words they have defined as meaning neither male or female. It's not that they are atypical. I believe they're probably typical and that they lack the ability to be able to introspect, therefore simply believe that they are different. Some children seem to have a very innate sense of their internal world, what we might call naturally emotionally intelligent or empathetic, empaths. And they do not seem to experience much gender confusion, while others exhibit the lack that is alexithymia and tend to question themselves. All of this is my own speculation about what someone with alexithymia is experiencing when they label themselves outside the binary. Because even if we could ask them the questions to define their experience, they may not be able to grasp it and their internal state enough to detail. It would first require them to have an understanding of the difference between sex as defined by genitals and chromosomes and how this is different from the genders masculine and feminine. Then parse the cultural influence of gender from what their natural character tendencies are through those gender labels. As in, clothing style by gender is a cultural influence, but does not mean you are male or masculine just because you like to wear clothes associated with men. How much of their feelings are socially and culturally dependent or even trauma-based versus being innate character traits? Those are things that I don't even expect the average person to know. Certainly not something I was even much in touch with even just 5 years ago. And much less someone who is divorced from their own inner world by way of alexithymia. Another source giving evidence to the links between autism and gender confusion can be found on the YouTube channel Healthy Gamer GG, which is run by a psychiatrist named Dr. Kanoja. A link to that video is in the description box as well. Let's return to the original impetus for this video, which is the consideration that Elliot Page may be on the autistic spectrum. Based on everything that I have just presented, if my body language analysis cannot be trusted as evidence to doubt the efficacy of medicalized gender treatment for Elliot because he's autistic, then we now have reason to doubt it due to the 50% plus chance that he has alexithymia, known to cause gender confusion. Said differently, an autism diagnosis makes gender confusion even more common, but this does not mean hormones and surgery are the answer. In fact, just talk therapy is known to be the best solution in most of those cases. Additionally, for me, testosterone supplementation is known to increase feelings of confidence in some females, which could both mask some mental health issues as well as provide a false sense of relief for a period of time. Given that it has been less than 3 years at the time of this video that Elliot has been dosing with testosterone, I believe more time is needed to tell if cross-sex hormone therapy was the correct treatment path for Elliot. Indeed, it's possible that one can be of atypical gender presentation and not need hormones or surgeries for optimal health. It happens all the time with tomboy females and feminine males. Lastly, I mentioned at the beginning of this video that all of this research helped me clean up my own room, so to speak. And here's what ayahuasca has to do with it all. It allowed me to put what feels like the last few pieces of my personal puzzle together to define my internal world, giving me a solid platform from which I can navigate my outer world more securely. Last summer, I participated in a weekend ayahuasca retreat, link above for all the details on that, which was more meant as a closing of one chapter of my life and a beginning of another. I had put the gender identity issue to rest at that point, having already been through talk therapy and was on testosterone 3 years with a top surgery complete. I came to the retreat with the goal of clearing any remaining personal blockages that I could not perceive and give myself a hard reset. I realized months afterwards one major thing that had occurred was that I reintegrated the emotional part of myself that had been fractured off. As in, all the emotions that I had suppressed as a child due to the environment being unsafe and or the lack of guidance in dealing with them came flooding back, and it hit me like a freight train. I had violent physical shakes during the time on ayahuasca, which I came to understand through the lens of somatic experience therapy as the nervous system purging the pent-up trauma. For a few months after, I had panic attacks, which I believe to be more of that purging, but also my body attempting to communicate to my brain when something needed addressed in my mental, emotional, or physical life. Something I had disconnected before and was now able to sense it again. All the emotional sensations I had shut out were now back, and I had a choice this time. I could let myself feel those things, believe that I would be all right, and process them properly, or fracture myself again in a false sense of safety. I believe what the ayahuasca started, and I finished, with my new mental framework was the curing of my trauma-induced alexithymia, the so-called right and left lobe brain connection the heart and brain coherence, and the integration of the shadow self. All of these phrases mentioned across different disciplines, for me meaning the same thing, which was referring to what I had just accomplished with the forceful aid of ayahuasca. The fact that I had trauma-induced alexithymia, which put me out of touch with a large part of myself, explained so much of my experience of life up to that point. That lack of attention inward was what partially allowed me to go my entire childhood and adolescence without questioning my gender experience. And when I finally did reflect internally in my late 20s, it was only my developed sense of caution that kept me from leaping into the first fix that I found for why I was becoming more miserable. Also, due to the extreme focus on logic and lack of emotional consideration, I reasoned what sort of treatment might be best for me versus the emotion-based, I just feel like a man. I didn't even know what that meant. Growing up pretty sheltered in a military community with the don't ask, don't tell policy kept me from getting the external exposure required of alexithymists in order to determine whether they resonate with it or not. It's embarrassing for me to admit this, but I didn't understand what the physical sensations of sexual arousal meant until I was nearly 18. I could feel them, but I confused them for just really enjoying that one girl's company. Okay. I've often said that I feel like I'm stumbling around in the dark until I'm introduced intellectually to a concept that sheds light on what I've been experiencing. I've had many other little indicators along the way that may also lend evidence to personally having a degree of alexithymia for years. People always came to me when they wanted the raw truth because I spared no information for the consideration of their feelings in receiving it, if they asked for it. I always found it terribly awkward to be around someone who was crying or upset and had to go through a lot of therapy to learn how to deal with it and be of help. I seem to have a large proportion of individuals on the autism spectrum who comment on my channel, claiming that they are, because they say they appreciate my flat, emotionless affect and my thought pattern, which is heavily logic-focused, and this is more appealing to that demographic. As a child, I was always more drawn to conversations with adults than to my own peers. I've struggled to identify feelings beyond anger or rage and extreme sadness. I got into a lot of fights with boys as a child because anger was a much more accessible emotion to me. And I'm working on a video about anger in young girls and how our society deals with that. My thoughts have always been very logic-focused, as far as I can remember, while emotions have terrified me because they seem to have no structure and overwhelm me to the point that I avoided them entirely for a very long time. They felt like an existential threat to me. So much so that when I took the Briggs-Myers test at the beginning of my personal introspective journey, I scored overwhelmingly as an INTJ, a coldly logical persona reserved for scientists and psychopaths. If children do not get the support they need in learning to navigate strong emotions, they can learn to become afraid of them, overwhelmed by them, and shut them out as a result. This is terribly unhealthy. Now in my 30s, I'm guessing that my lack of social grace has been smoothed over by lots of practice in social settings, observing behavior and piecing together appropriate responses. It makes the comment, "you must be allistic," somewhat comical to me because I was passing somewhat as a person without alexithymia. A person who was both alexithymic and female, appearing as male and allistic due to medical changes and learned behavior to fit in.
I'm a dude playing a dude disguised as another dude.
I believe that is what one might call a mindfuck. So, that's my story, and how Elliot Page, autism, alexithymia, ayahuasca, and transgenderism all met for tea. That sounds like the start of a joke. So Elliot and the Triple A's walk into a bar, you see? Nah. Cheers. Till next tea time.